marriages and so forth. So we've been talking about the divine design for marriage designed by God. And a lot of people think Jesus didn't say much about it because he was not married while here in the flesh. But in Matthew the 19th chapter, he deals with marriage, particularly the idea of commitment. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what some threats are about that. People came actually testing him, not necessarily looking for information. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And so we tend to kind of take the Pharisees' tack on this often, those of us who preach, and we think this is a text about marriage and divorce. And Jesus does address that. Somebody asked me when I put up the advertisement on my social media for this weekend, are you going to talk about divorce and remarriage? And my answer was, if it comes up, yes. We don't shy away from questions about divorce and remarriage or sexuality or sexual orientation or anything that comes up, but that's not really what the focus of this class is about. We prefer to focus on things that prevent divorce, that talk about commitment and why we should be committed. And we don't exactly take the approach, you may have heard the story about the older couple that was celebrating, 60 or so years of marriage, and somebody interviewed him and asked, have you ever thought about divorce? And the woman said, no, not really. Murder, yes, but not divorce. And that's the kind of commitment that we're talking about when we look at things biblically. Jesus went on to say, this is verse 8, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives under the Mosaic law, but from the beginning it has not been this way. And that's one thing we've emphasized in these classes, is to go back to the beginning, to go back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that Jesus puts together actually in this text. And he does talk about adultery here and about immorality, fornication, things that can lead to divorce. But I want to concentrate on some other things this morning. So let's put something up on the screen here if we can. All right. So what are some threats and challenges? And again, if you have your workbook, this is kind of a summary of page 22. And some of this I talked about with the guys. I don't know that the women got much in. We didn't get to all of it. So when people marry, they sometimes come with different families of origin. Often that's the case. We talked about the different challenges of communication. And I like the little spaghetti diagram that's back on page 8, where in my case I came from kind of the left-hand side of that chart, very very closed up, very Germanic, very Middle West. Betty came from one that was more like the spaghetti end of the chart, and so we had some adjustments to make. That's not necessarily the most difficult one. Sometimes there are kind of superficial attraction questions. Sometimes there are sexuality issues involved in this. We have not had a chance to talk much about that. There's a section in the back in your bibliography that raises or that discusses sexuality issues. We put 3 or 4 different ones, and particularly the exposition of the Song of Songs, what in some Bibles is called the Song of Solomon, and we discussed that. And Betty and I actually did a special issue. I should have put this in here, but I didn't. I will come back to that, but we did an issue of Truth Magazine that was totally devoted to the Bible and human sexuality. It's not something that Christians often talk about publicly. We thought this ought to be done, and so we not only put that together, talked about Song of Solomon. I had an article there, the Song of Songs and Beyond is what I called it, and we enlisted some elders and elders' wives. One of our adult daughters, who's raising teenage daughters, wrote an article with an elder's wife on kind of a, not spoof exactly, but 12 ways to drive our daughters into inappropriate sexual relationships. In other words, what not to do if you are raising daughters. So we talked about that sort of thing and don't have time to unpack all of that today, but if people come with differing values about sexuality or about any kind of other issue, then there are going to be problems in the marriage. And some of the paper and pencil exercises that we put in here are meant to flesh that kind of thing out. If you look, for example, on page 5, just a simple true false. Some of the others ask you to put things on a 1 to 7 scale, or something like that. And all of these are designed not for us to tell you what we think about, although we're happy to do that, but it's designed to start discussions or continue discussions among couples, among members of the church here, those who have been coming to the classes. But number 7 particularly is one that years ago when we started doing this, back in the 1980s, about the time I met Mark in one of the hymn classes, nearly everybody would have agreed that number 7 was false. I believe it is not harmful to have sexual intercourse before marriage if the couple has a meaningful relationship. You can't count on even Christians today agreeing with that statement. And I'm not here to try to say, I'm just saying let's look at the Bible and see what that says. But for the purposes of these classes, if somebody comes to a relationship and they think that's true, that that's right, and somebody else thinks, no, that's not a biblical viewpoint, then there's going to be conflict in that. And so how we express our love and affection, how we, to go back to the diagram here, let me get back to where we were, how we communicate with each other, all of these, sometimes it can be superficial and yet might not be so superficial. I talked with the guys about this 50-50 kind of an idea that's really, I believe, an erroneous, a hurtful kind of approach that says if my husband or my wife is only giving, she needs to give 50%, I need to give 50%. Well, that's a recipe for disaster in many cases, because what happens is maybe none of us ever get to 50% because this idea kicks in that if she's only giving 40, then I only have to give 40. And if she's down to 35, then I only have to give 35. And you can see where that train wreck is headed. So guys, as heads of the house, as the Christ model, if you will, or Christ modeling the church, which we'll talk about in the second hour, it's our job to make sure we're not just giving 50%. Even if our wives are, for whatever reason, not, we need to step up. And if we have different ideas about this, or if our motivation is based upon just how I feel at the moment, upon changing feelings, then that's going to be an issue or a problem. And by the way, I didn't ask if this is going to be a class or not, but if I'm fine if somebody wants to say, I got a question about this, or would you say more about that, raise your hand. I'm happy to try to respond. And Mark's saying that's okay. So we'll do it that way. I should have said that at the very beginning. But there are other things that we probably need to talk about, and as with every one of these subjects, we can always circle back and discuss anything that you would like to do that. A failure, number 3, to anticipate selfishness, which is a huge issue in marriages. We're living in a me culture, in case anybody hasn't noticed. And sometimes early in the relationship, if we don't develop an attitude of appreciation, if we don't develop an attitude of what I want to talk about in a minute, small caring deeds. Kyle, wherever you are, this might be part of your 28. I see you back there. Your 28 item challenge. I don't know. We'll get to that in a moment. But often when we take this 50-50 kind of approach, we can start to focus on what our wife or our husband is not doing. Where are they falling down? They're not doing this, and I think they should be doing that, so I don't need to do this. And that, of course, is a natural disaster waiting to happen. When we start to reflect disapproval, and that's what our wife or our husband begins to hear from us. If they experience rejection, and they become discouraged, and guys especially, we have to step up and not be that guy that's unwilling to communicate love and affection to our wives. Failure to achieve oneness, if I can advance to the next one. Big idea that we talked about Friday and Saturday. You go back to these texts in Genesis 1 and 2 that Jesus is quoting here in Matthew 19. That's what he does. He takes us back to the beginning. And the whole context there is, how do we become one? How can we have communion with God, first of all? But how can we have communion? How can we be one with each other? And we talked a little bit about this idea of surrendering independence to become interdependent. Now, not codependent, where we're merely accelerating each other's bad tendency, but to become interdependent so that we are working together as one, which is what the Bible teaches that we ought to be. And a selfish kind of nature is antithetical to that. It drives us apart. And that's what Satan wants. He came to Eve with the old line, God really said. You think God really cares about whether you eat this or that or something? Why would God care? Let me tell you why he cares. Because he knows you'll be as wise as he is. And so that's how Satan begins to approach us sometimes. Does God really mean what he says? Does the Bible really teach what I think it teaches? Does it really say that we're to achieve oneness? Does it really teach that wives are to be in subjection to their husbands? Our culture pulls us away from all of those biblical ideas. And so we need to pay attention to all of this. I put a slide in there that talks about affairs. And I mean by that not just what we commonly call a love affair, that is a sexual liaison with somebody that you're not married to. We dress that up by calling it an affair rather than what it is, which is generally a mess. And it's often an escape from reality that's not in the marriage. When we talked with the guys yesterday about pornography, whether it's the kind of visual looking at pictures or getting out on your phone, watching a video, whatever, or whether it's more the what sometimes appeals more to women, pornography of the ear, or maybe the novels like 50 Shades of Grey or what have you, mommy porn, some people call it. What happens is that whatever the form is, it's often a search for fantasy that's not in the marriage. Something's lacking in the marriage. It may be affection, it may be companionship, it may be communication, but whatever it is, people are looking outside their marriage. And as we discussed yesterday with some real life examples that go back generations, guys, if you're not providing what your wife needs, if you don't know what your wife needs, and you're not providing that, then Satan, who is crafty and powerful and walks about as a roaring lion seeking prey whom he may devour, he will put before your wife some man who looks better to her than you do because he's willing to provide what you are not. And so we need to be in touch, in communion, in communication with our wives to ask, to find out what is it that you need. What will make you feel complete and what they would rather have that from us. They're not necessarily looking for this, but if we're not providing it, if we're not giving them support when they're home, maybe bearing our children, wiping the runny noses, cleaning the commode, changing the diapers, doing the dishes, and all of the things, when our culture tells them you'd be better off as a woman being out in the business world or climbing the corporate ladder or doing something that would make your life more interesting, and you've got a woman, a wife who's willing to do what I just described in terms of caring, support that. Give her all of the nourishment and the encouragement that she needs. So that's what we're talking about. But it might not be a love affair. It might be what we might call a career affair. A lot of us as guys tend to get involved in our work, and I've worked secular work, and I know how seductive that can be, but I can tell you, somebody that's also been a full-time preacher from time to time, and am now attending to the affairs of the church. This is true when I was an elder. Can sometimes be a black hole on your time and pull you away from your wife and maybe other family issues. So it might be what we would call a career affair, or a love affair with materialism. Got to get the bigger paycheck, got to get a better job, got to climb the corporate ladder, got to have a second job, we have to have two incomes, and so forth. Or it might be an activity thing. But if we're investing more in our sports or our hobbies or our fishing or whatever it might happen to be, book collecting if you're into that, can also be an addiction. But if that's overshadowing what we're doing with our wives or with our husbands, maybe sometimes just apathy, that we lose interest, the flame goes out. Any fire that's not tended generally is going to go out. And that's kind of one of the themes of this, is even just the small caring deeds that we do. So let me talk a little bit about some of that. In the next hour, I want to talk about forgiveness when we talk about Christ and the church. So I'm going to skip over that. And I don't really want to talk about deteriorating marriages, although we've all seen marriages that come apart through this sort of cycle of you get out of the romantic phase into a transition phase, and then the reality sets in that this is not at all what I thought it was going to be. And sometimes when we start looking for the faults and weaknesses in our spouse, we find all sorts of things, and can even go to a retaliation phase. She did that, or he did this, so I'm going to do that. His misdeed or her neglect gives me the right to do something else, and that is simply a recipe for disaster. So let me talk a little bit about some of the small things that we might be able to do. Anybody questions before? I'm going to shift gears here. So anybody have question or comment before we dive into another, maybe more practical area? I know you all are a talkative bunch because you have been for the last 2 days.
They were in the church, can't talk.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, we get into a building and we're like, whoa, we can't talk about that. So, all right, well, we can always circle back to anything. Caring deeds are what we call small behaviors. We're not talking about moving a mountain here, but just the kind of little things. And Kyle, I don't know if this is what you had in mind with your 28-day project, but I'll talk about what we mean by that. They're very specific behaviors, things that you can focus on and say, I could do this today. I could do this right now. I mean, I don't have to wait another hour to do some of this, or I could do it before the day is out. They're positive behaviors. They get us to shift off the focus of what may be negative, what's not being done, areas that our expectations are not being met, and refocus that on things that are positive, that are good about the relationship, or maybe can be magnified in the relationship. And they are repeatable behaviors. It's not the kind of thing like the guy said where he told his wife, I told you I loved you the day we got married, and if I change my mind, I'll let you know. These are things that you can do repeatedly, even during the day. And so a list might look something like this. Now, you make your own list, or if you've already got 28, I'd be happy to hear what some of these others are. Take the trash out without being asked. I'll tell you that some of these are an issue in our relationship, and I'm a work in progress. I'm working on this. We said in the beginning, we are not here as experts to tell you this is how we do it, and so you ought to do it that way. We don't have babies anymore, but give the baby a bath. Help out with even a little deed that might be helpful to your wife. Reach over and touch me when we're writing. Actually, some of this comes from feedback that we've had in other seminars like this. Call during the day just to say hello, just to say I love you. Not, would you pick up this at the store, or can you do this, or what time are we doing that? But just with no agenda, no other need, just to say I love you, I miss you, I like talking to you. Doesn't take much time, but just to do something like that. Be responsive to my sexual advances. Ask what music I'd like to hear, and then play it. So that when you get the information, do something about it is the idea. Help to get dinner on the table. Help to clear the table. One of the biggest arguments, not really an argument, that Betty and I ever had when we were young married with a good friend of ours, and it wound up talking about, as it often does, who does the dishes? And my friend Tom and I wound up doing the dishes that night after a somewhat animated discussion. But be helpful about the kind of things that might be burdensome to your wife. Compliment my appearance, some women have said. Now, these kind of small caring deeds can teach us to know more about our partner, to know more about what their needs are and what we should be doing, to know how to please them, because if we're communicating and we ask, what is it that you need? Betty, can I tell them the Valentine story again? I told the guys. Did you tell the women? No, some of you are nodding. Well, it's worth repeating probably. And it's maybe like the egg yolk story. I don't know. First Valentine's Day, when we were married, I got up and I knew that it was Valentine's Day, and Mark's admonition, Valentine's Day, birthdays, anniversaries, those kind of things, guys, red letter dates, make sure you don't let them pass. But I knew it was Valentine's Day, and I asked, what would you like for Valentine's Day? Now, we were young and broke. I was a young preacher just starting out. They were paying me $75 a month, I think. And I was working in a lumber yard to supplement that. And we were both going to school, so we didn't have a lot of money. And so Betty said, Oh, nothing. So guess what she got? Now, I did stumble into a store during the day and buy a card, but this became a kind of an issue, and I said to her, you know, I think you know that if I knew that you wanted this, that you needed something else, I would move heaven and earth if I could to make that happen. But one thing I am not a mind reader. You will need to get into my thick skull, this is what I need, especially if I ask you what it is. Let's get out of this. You ought to know that automatically. I'm sorry, I did not get that chip. I don't know automatically what she needs, although I've got a better idea after a few years than I do when I was starting out. So guess what she gets on Valentine's? I got her a dozen roses the next year and every year since then. She has my attention, but that's what we're talking about with regard to finding out what your wife wants, what she needs. And it's not really that she needs roses, I guess, but she likes my attention, and to know that if she wants something or needs something, I'm happy to provide that for her. So we talk about caring deeds, which help us to know what are the priorities of our spouse, and to experience when others bless us, when somebody's doing something for us, whether it's my wife or someone else, to be willing to accept that blessing and to be thankful for that and to be grateful for it. It's a sort of a cyclical kind of thing, that somebody does a good deed, even a small caring deed that's positive and repeatable. It engenders a kind of response that in itself is positive. It helps us to practice being a blessing to others, sharing what we have, not just with our wives maybe, but with others as well. And it teaches us to be thankful to others for the rewards that we get for the things that are done. There are just all kinds of positive aspects to all of this. And it maybe helps us to evaluate behaviors, to be able to see this when I do this, I get that result. If I'm doing small caring behaviors, in many ways it engenders a response that I get small caring behaviors in return. Not that that's necessarily the goal of it, but it is a kind of a cyclical sort of a process, if you will. Now let me move to a different. Anybody want to comment on that? Kyle, is this in line with what you've been talking about, or do you want to add anything to this, or
Very much so.
extend my list?
There was just one other one I was going to go, if you'll go back to the list. Thank you. No, you can leave all of them on there.
Okay. So is that what or did you want the next one?
Yeah, that's one.
Is that it?
So the very last one that I think I would add, it teaches us to evaluate our priorities. I think you
Yes.
have that on there. You said know their priorities, but to know our priorities.
All right. Very good.
Because sometimes, like you said, hunting season at work, the month of November is shot because all the supervisors are taking off to go deer hunting.
Yeah.
But we learn what our priorities are, and it teaches us that really our wife is one of our main priorities.
Yeah.
We forget. We get busy with job, kids, paying taxes, sports event. You know, everybody
Yep.
watched baseball for 2 months. You know, because it was enjoyable this year, and so we lose priority, and it helps us to refocus what our priority is.
Yeah. And depends on your perspective. If you're a Cubby fan, it wasn't that enjoyable the last part of it. Anyway, go ahead.
Congregation here.
Understand. All right. Well, thank you very much for that clarification and addition. That's good. Anybody else? Comment. And I was supposed to quit at 10:15. Is that right? All right. I think we can make it that far. Okay. So I came across this work a few years ago that sort of underscores what I've been talking about, what Kyle just said. This is a divorce lawyer's guide to staying married. What does a divorce lawyer learn from processing divorces day in and day out all year long? And some of the things that this divorce lawyer said correspond to the kind of thing that we've been talking about. So, a divorce lawyer's guide to staying married. Empathize. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. learn to feel what they feel. Learn what their thoughts are, what our wives are thinking, what they need, what they don't like, what they don't need. Sometimes it may not be roses that she needs. She needs something else. And if I substitute what she really needs at that particular time for, hey, here's a dozen roses, that's not really the point of the activity. So empathy in terms of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. This divorce lawyer says, go back to the beginning. Remember, what was it that attracted you? You chose this person to marry. Somebody said the other day, marriage ought to be fun. You remember what it was like when you were dating? It was a blast. You couldn't wait to be with the other person. Hung on every word. And so they're saying, go back to the beginning. Remember what it was that attracted you. And then do the obvious, starting with listen, which is a supremely important part of communication. Now, that may be obvious. Oh, yeah, communication is about listening. Sure, everybody knows that. But we don't always practice the obvious things that we know we're supposed to be doing. And as we said in the beginning, part of this course, this exercise, whatever we're calling it, is there's no magic bullet here. You probably know 90% or maybe even 100% of everything we've said this weekend. It's about getting back to basic, simple things that all of us can do that help enrich and restore and advance our marriages. And ultimately, commitment over everything else. Commitment that says, I am going to stay with you in sickness and in health. I'm going to care for you, whatever comes. I'm committed to you. I'm not interested in not just another person, but you're more important to me than my career. You're more important to me than my hobbies. You're more important to me than whatever project I'm working on at the time. That needs to be clear. And even, I'll add this, even more important than the children. Child-focused marriages sometimes, when the kids leave and the marriage has been focused in child, that's almost a textbook definition of a dysfunctional marriage. And sometimes that's when marriages fall apart because they've been so focused on the children that there's just no other kind of a foundation or a basis there. And once the kids are gone, there's not much left of the relationship. So, Betty, I know you've talked. Anything I should add about that? I mean, you've done a lot of work in that area. So, what am I leaving out here? All right. She says I'm doing a good job. So, I will take her at her word. Anybody else?
Steve,
Yes.
years ago I was associated with a support group for divorcing men.
Okay.
And something that struck me about those guys, it was very common for them to feel like they were completely blindsided when the divorce papers showed up. Mm-hmm. They were so oblivious to whatever the problems were that they didn't even see it at all. Later, I was on a radio show and I stated a statistic that the vast majorities of divorces are filed by women. And it so took this guy back, David Gold guy, that after my segment was over and I was driving home, he asked women to call in and tell them, why did you file for divorce? It was kind of a herd mentality thing, but they were all saying the same thing. They said, well, he wouldn't listen to me.
Okay, yeah. Wouldn't listen. And so, and I think that means that we not only, when we're hearing complaints, but to actively seek out what, and make a safe environment. We talked a little bit about this earlier, where my wife can feel like she can talk with me and I'm not going to blow up, I'm not going to reject her. If I haven't created that kind of safe environment where she can say that, then she's not likely to say anything to me. And maybe that's where a lot of the blindsiding comes in, and I appreciate your comment on that. Anybody else? I think it's a really good insight. Thank you. All right, well, let's see. Let's talk a little bit about intimacy in terms of the use that we have. Yeah, Betty?
Before you go on.
Okay.
There's an idea that I really like. It talks about listening with a third ear.
Yes.
And it means I want to hear the most important things that you're saying to me. And I'm not the one who decides what's important, you are. So,
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it.
Okay, yeah. I mentioned listening with a third ear yesterday, but yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's a common phrase that simply means I'm really paying attention and trying to focus on what this person is really saying. And sometimes, as we discussed yesterday, the message can be mixed. And you do have to listen with the third ear for what is this person actually saying. Because sometimes the message is not always coming through loud and clear. Betty's talked a lot about communication theory. I don't know if you did this, but you have a sender and a receiver, and often you have past history noise or some kind of static in between. And so you may think that you are sending a very clear signal, a very clear message, but it's not being received because of either past experiences or maybe somebody just not willing to listen, they're not paying attention. So that it's important not only for the sender to be very clear, but for those of us who are on the receiving end to make sure that we're really tuned into that frequency.
I think a large part of it is trust.
Is trust, yes.
And when you do that, you gain trust. So when you don't do that, you knock it back down here.
Yeah. And that it's the more times that gets knocked back down, the harder it is to regain that kind of trust level where someone feels safe about saying this. And I mean, sometimes guys have the same sort of thing. If the wife is likely to blow up and withdraw when we're trying to say this is something that I need or that's important, then hey, we're not going to go there again. Maybe that's just a natural human reflex. But it works both ways. Mark, were you wanting to say something?
Yeah, Sylvia.
Okay,
I
so
just, because you said something that you didn't repeat, and I'm afraid some people couldn't have heard
Yeah,
it. And so I'm going to.
I tried to repeat some of it, but go ahead, yes. Yeah.
And that is, she said, listening to what you're saying, not to what I want to hear. I
Yeah.
thought that was a really important aspect of what she said.
Yeah. And to be focused on what is important to the
Right.
sender and not what I mean, that's another thing that gets a filter in between sender and receiver. So thank you. That's a good clarification. All right. Yeah, Mark, good.
And I think that approach, I like the idea of listening with the third ear. And you're in a very sincere mode. You're encouraging
Yeah.
transparency, honesty, and that's how you come to know your spouse. It's how you come to know yourself.
Yes. Amen. Well said, brother. Thank you. Anybody else? Want to do one last thing before our time is up? And again, we can always come back and circle to anything that you think maybe I haven't said enough about. We've talked a lot about this idea of intimacy, and we mean by that not sexual intimacy, although that's a part of intimacy. That's one way to be intimate. But as with the other Sternberg triangles and other things that we talked about, we're talking here more about broader-based emotional personhood issue. So intimacy means desiring to promote the welfare of your loved one, to seek the best for what your loved one needs, particularly as they have expressed that. And maybe sometimes it might need to be, and this works with children as well, you may need to say something that's hard and that they're not necessarily willing to appreciate. But if they need to hear that, then it needs to be expressed in a loving way. It's not loving to withhold a hard conversation because you're afraid that it'll hurt the feelings of the loved one. They need to hear that, but it can be done in ways that, as we talked about, having that hard, that difficult conversation. There are several pages in the outline sheet that talk about that. Holding the loved one in high regard. I'm saying this, I'm doing this because I love you, because I believe it is for your good. Maybe in response to something that they have actually said, I need you to do this. I need you to listen to me, or this is a need that I have at that particular moment. Intimacy involves expressing happiness with your loved one. Part of the small caring deeds that say, I'm delighted to be married to you, I'm glad we're here, I'm glad we're together. You can't say that enough, I think. Having mutual understanding with the loved one. communicating together. One of the things that I thought was on the chart of the small caring deeds, that something I have to work on is go to bed with me at the same time at night. I tend to want to keep working on something after she says I'm going to bed. So if that, for whatever that's worth, but arriving at this mutual understanding of what works for the two of you, not necessarily what works for anybody else, being able to count on your loved one in times of need. All of these involve, as Mark said just a moment ago, learning to know your wife, your husband, and to have a kind of dependency. Valuing your loved one, sharing yourself and your possessions with your loved one. Again, these are all pretty obvious kind of things, but maybe back to your point, sometimes it's the obvious thing that we don't get, or we don't listen, or it doesn't register, so we keep repeating that. Receiving emotional support from your loved one. This is a two-way street. And while I'm trying to be supportive, I need to be able to receive and to value and to express appreciation for the kind of support that I get from my wife, who is supportive of my work. And I appreciate that. Sometimes we take that for granted, and I may not say that enough, but I need to value the kind of emotional support that I receive from her. And giving emotional support, again, this becomes an almost cyclical kind of thing, that the more one person does this, the more it elicits that same kind of response from someone else. And then number 10, communicating intimately with your loved one, with your wife, your husband. We keep coming back to communication. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We put this whole list of passages. If you've got your outline, you'll look at page 3. It's what we started with. So I'm coming back to kind of close the circle, ring the bell again. No man ever spoke like this man spoke. John tells us in John 7. Spoken by a Roman trooper, hardened with his military experience, who was sent out to arrest this lowly carpenter, and he comes back and he can only stammer to his commanding officer. I never heard anybody speak like this. I've always wondered what his commanding officer said in response to that. But you got all these other passages that talk about communication and how we communicate. And again, a mantra that we'll talk about more in the next hour: let all bitterness and wrath and clamor and anger and slander be put away from you. With all malice, be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. And that's repeated not only in Ephesians, it's in Colossians, it's in some other texts as well. We focused on those particular things. And in the next hour, we'll talk about some of John's passages where he talks about saying and doing, that we're going to talk the talk, we need to walk the walk. All right, we have about 2.5 minutes left, if the clock is right. Who's got questions or comments? This is your last chance, okay? We're not doing questions in the next hour.
One thing that
Yeah.
Al and I experienced
Okay.
in our life is that when I met Alma, she had 2 children.
All right.
So we married in as a family. And once our children ended up leaving, it was a change in the way we live.
Yeah.
So it took me about 3 to 6 months to get used to the fact that we didn't have children in the house anymore. And it was a little bit of adjustment,
Yeah.
but I absolutely loved it. So
Yeah. It was an adjustment for you to come to a marriage relationship with that kind of background, to go back to the very first point. That's a tremendous adjustment. But yes, when the kids leave, you know, there's an expression, DINK, D-I-N-K, double income, no kids. And you may recall the old BMW commercial where they're advertising all of the things that you do with kids, you know, orthodontic expenses and school tuition and so forth and so on. And then as that list scrolls up, the garage door raises and there's the BMW to the Hallelujah chorus. Yes, it does bring some opportunities for service and the use of income and time that have been invested in kids that we can share with fellow Christians or do other things that are worthwhile in terms of community activities. But yeah, I mean, we went through that, and if the marriage is only focused on raising the kids and not developing a relationship between husband and wife, what's going to be left when all the kids have left? Or at least there's a bumper sticker that says it's not an empty nest till they get their stuff out of the basement, which in our experience is also correct. But thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Anything else that you want to share with us? All right, we're down to 30 seconds maybe. Who else? Anybody? Well, I'm ready to stop then. I mean, we can quit 30 minutes or 30 seconds early or however much it is, and I appreciate your attention. You've been a great audience to speak to and to listen to the things that we've said. I hope it's been helpful. It's always helpful to us. We learn to refocus on some things, to go through a reset and to refresh our relationship. And I hope it has been that for you, even if you're already in a good relationship. So thanks, and we'll take the normal break here before our worship service. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.